This is the third of our three-part series on death. And in this one, we're going to ask a very hard set of questions. And I want to warn you about this because there are people who have struggled through the loss of suicide. Someone close to them has died. And we all need to remember that when a son or a mother or someone close like that commits suicide, it leaves an open wound that never heals. That pain is always right there. So, keeping that in mind as we explore, please understand, I know that this is a tough topic. Before I go any further, I'll show you the last of my 3 spirit money notes. And this one is worth 500 million, whatever. 500 million spirit dollars, I guess. I'll tell you in a little while what to do with that, okay? At any rate, the question that we're really focusing on to start us here is, who owns my life? We think we got a quick answer to that. Well, of course I own my life. But not really, because the truth of the matter is that the state can take my life away from me. They can say, we're executing you because you did something we don't like. Or they can say, we're drafting you into the military and sending you off to defend the rest of us. And we're going to have you go off the boats first on D-Day. And unfortunately, you're going to be cut down, killed by the Germans. But, you know, it's better for the rest of us to do it that way. The state makes decisions that really imply that it owns us. This is kind of an interesting conversation to deal with in China, because China, when we're considering China, because China has a long history of the state trumping over the individual. The collective, the whole, is more important than the individual. Whereas in the United States, we have a long tradition of the individual is more important than the big lump. Both sides cross over, though. Trust me, in the United States, we don't really have absolute individual rights. We have individual rights only insofar as the state, the collective, is willing to grant them to us. And I think that's the problem when it comes to suicide. I want to take my life. And the state says, no, you can't do that. And in a few of our states, we've enacted a right to die clause or assisted suicide law. But mostly in the United States, we said no. The state says no. And if we are going to say yes, we say yes, you have a right to assisted suicide. We are really saying that the state has the right to give us that right. That they are the ultimate. And they can give it to us and they can take it away from us. So the state gets to determine. Suicide's tough. There is a horribly high rate of suicide amongst 13 and 14-year-olds. And their suicides are usually caused by a complete lack of perspective. They live inside a cloud. Some of them live inside a cloud of just bad news. And they don't see how it could possibly ever be different. And so in that moment, they take their lives. And when they do, they leave behind that pain for their families. They were so limited in their perspective, they couldn't even see how destructive this act was going to be to those around them. And anybody who makes it to 19 or 39 or 59 knows very well that that cloud is going to part and that life will be different. That it's not always going to be dark like it is there. Life is constantly changing. Hang on. But they don't have that perspective at 13 or 14, do they? And there are a lot of times when people are facing into a disease and they think, I can handle this. I just can't go through this much pain. And they commit suicide. But again, it's probably a perspective thing. Because a lot of times people do go through that much pain. They find a way to manage the pain and stay alive and vibrant with the people around them to the end. So you want to say to them, for those who have made it through all of that, if they could, to come back and say to them, no, you just don't see where you're headed here. But sometimes people do that suicide for somebody else, right? You're in the middle of a disease, maybe your HIV is turned into full-blown AIDS, and you know what that's going to mean as you go through this process. It's going to be a horrible thing. And although you could handle it, you do not want to put your family through it. You don't want them to have to watch you waste away and die like that. And so you commit suicide on behalf of them. I knew a guy who was in his early 70s and he had cancer, and he came home from the hospital. It was Christmas Eve. And they were all getting ready to go to Christmas Mass that night. And we got a phone call from his wife, Marion, and she had horrible news that she had heard the gunshot in the garage. He had decided it would be better for her if she didn't watch him waste away. And yet, in the end, the rest of her Christmases were dampened. She couldn't escape that darkness of Christmas ever again for the rest of her life. So we do it for somebody else. Or do we? Yeah, sometimes I think we do. I know there's that suicide where the guy in the foxhole jumps on the hand grenade. He knows he's going to die. He lets himself be killed so that the other 4 people in the foxhole don't die. That's a World War II metaphor. You want a more modern one? Just a little while ago was the Las Vegas shooting, and there was a husband who threw his wife down and covered her up, and he got shot all that. He died, and she lived. That is a suicide on behalf of someone else. And in that particular case, I don't know that any of us questions the value of it. So we are saying that suicide can sometimes be right. And in fact, we have a very famous story of a suicide. It's Jesus. That's right, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. You see, when he walked into the Garden of Gethsemane that night, he knew what was going to happen. I'm not talking about being omniscient. He just knew. He knew that they were going to get coming because you can read the lay of the land. And as he saw the torchlights coming through the trees in the garden, he could have turned around and walked out the back exit of the Garden of Gethsemane, but he didn't. He stuck it out. And when his disciples all, "We'll step up for you," he says, "Back down. Let it happen." And they carried him away and they executed him. Well, you could say, though, they executed him, but since he was in control of it all, that makes it suicide. Suicide by cop. We know what suicide by cop is: a person who doesn't want to pull the trigger themselves, so reaches into their pocket and pulls out a wallet and gets gunned down on the doorstep. Yeah, Jesus was suicide by cop, and yet it was good, people say, because he died for other people's sins. He died so that other people could live. That's the Christian message. So we're saying that suicide can be good. But we're also, I think, recognizing that suicide can be bad, right? And then there is this question of the long, slow suicide. Sometimes suicide is quick. You know, you pull a trigger or you sit in your car until the carbon monoxide takes you out. But sometimes suicide is long and drawn out. My mom was like that. She was unhappy, a very unhappy woman, and she drank heavily and she smoked heavily, and we always said to her, "You've got to stop this." And she says, "I'll die when I die." She was hastening the process. So the person who is abusing their body, who ends up weighing far too much, who ends up smoking far too much, who ends up drinking far too much, who does very little in terms of exercise, isn't that a long, slow suicide? And that gets us back to who owns me. Because I think about the person who smokes so heavily and ends up with lung cancer and then wastes away in the hospital, and who's paying for that bill? All of us around have to make up for that long, slow suicide. Who owns us? It's a challenge question. Okay, you know all that banknote stuff, the spirit money? You got those 3 amounts. I want you to add those 3 numbers together and then send me in an email just that one number that's the total. And I'll get you attendance for the day. Sound good? All right. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.